Hopes of a pause in the fighting in Ukraine have been dashed today. Russia has ignored a unilateral ceasefire declared by Kyiv, striking several targets in overnight attacks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy offered the truce in response to Russia's request for hostilities to be halted later this week, when it will commemorate the end of the Second World War with a military parade.
This is Russia's response to the ceasefire announced by Ukraine. Here in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, several homes were damaged in the attacks. And in Sumy, a drone hit a kindergarten. No children were in the building during the strike, but a woman working as a security guard was killed, and several other people were wounded.
Truce? There will be no truce. Not in our lifetime and not in yours.
Ukraine's leaders say the missile and drone strikes show once again that Russia is not serious about saving lives, despite its own call for a halt to the fighting. Preparations are being put in place for a scaled-back military parade in Moscow on May 9th, and Russia has announced a two-day ceasefire to coincide with it. It's warned Ukraine not to disrupt the commemorations, which mark the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. Writing on social media, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said, "It's obvious to any reasonable person that a full-scale war and the daily murdering of people are a bad time for public celebrations." He had earlier vowed to respond in kind if Russia violated the truce announced by Ukraine, and on the streets of Kyiv, there's support for that position.
Perhaps we should act the same way Russia does. That is, not to stay silent, not to observe the truce. We have no other choice.
Russians only understand force. I think they need to be defeated in their own country, and I think we should still launch our drones to fly over their parade.
As Russians gather to honour the victors of a long-past war, even a pause in the war that defines today appears out of grasp.
And DW's Nick Connolly is standing by now with the view from Kyiv. So Nick, why has Ukraine now again declared a ceasefire effective at midnight today? Hasn't Russia already demonstrated that it's ignoring Kyiv's request to cease hostilities?
Sarah, I think this was about showing up Russia that Russia doesn't intend any serious moves towards a longer ceasefire. This is simply about guaranteeing the optics of Vladimir Putin's parade on Red Square in Moscow and nothing more than that. The fact that we have seen Russia attack as before over 1,800 times since that Ukrainian ceasefire came into effect from midnight, going today, shows you that nothing really is going to change. I think the interesting thing will be to see how Ukraine reacts. Right now, we've had kind of very differing briefings doing the rounds here in Kyiv. Some sources indicating that given that Russia has not stopped hitting Ukraine, we've had an attack on a kindergarten in Sumy overnight. We've had residential buildings in Kharkiv hit, as we heard there in the report, that Ukraine reserves the right to attack the parade on May the 9th in Moscow. Other briefings seeming to suggest that maybe Ukraine will just take advantage of the fact that Russia is basically concentrating all its air defences in Moscow now to protect that parade, to attack other targets in Russia. But this is, from Ukraine's perspective, just another sign that the Russian side cares about the parade, cares about Vladimir Putin's historical role, showing himself as that kind of heir to the Soviet tradition, and is less interested in any end to the fighting here in Ukraine.
And Moscow has said that it will remove military hardware from the procession for the first time in almost 20 years. How is that move being interpreted, Nick?
Well, certainly that is something that goes down very well here, and you'll see lots of people on Telegram saying that's just because they've run out of equipment, and the good, more modern systems they do have are all on the front lines here in Ukraine. I think the other thing that really has taken people by surprise here in Ukraine is the real kind of visceral reaction you've had from Russians on social media and elsewhere to the limitations on internet, on mobile internet capacity in Moscow. They've already been tested in the last couple of days, but they are expected to go into kind of more widespread effect over the next few days ahead of that parade, because mobile internet is crucial for the navigation of drones and other missile systems that Ukraine could send in the direction of Moscow. So a real clampdown there on mobile internet, on even SMS and other kind of basic mobile telephony services. And that is something that is seemingly getting people's backs up a whole lot more than the war here in Ukraine, which lots of people in Russia are obviously able to kind of zone out of and pretend is happening somewhere far away. So that's a real kind of interesting moment where it really seems like this is really hitting home for ordinary Russians. Also talk of basic kind of security shutdown in Moscow, heightened security measures, and basically very few foreign guests. Very different picture to the kinds of parades that Vladimir Putin has been trying to put on during this war in Ukraine to show that Russia has allies and is able to basically kind of localize the war to Ukraine and continue living normally in Moscow.
And both sides have, to your point, Nick, both sides have stepped up strikes in recent weeks. Where does the war stand?
So in terms of those Ukrainian strikes on Russia, we really have seen an uptick there, not only in the kind of payloads that those Ukrainian drones are taking to Russian oil facilities, for instance. They've been able to reach Russian oil facilities quite far away, over 1,000 kilometers in some case, from Ukraine for a while now, but those were often pretty small payloads and quite localized damage. That is really changing now. And at a much greater frequency, the attacks on Tuapse on the Black Sea, those oil facilities there being hit basically every couple of days now for a prolonged period. Every time the fires go out, a new drone attack comes in. And we're really seeing that Russia is struggling. Some of these oil refineries are now having to basically pause for repairs. Elsewhere, talk of oil exports being reduced because they just can't move the oil around. So that really is a kind of new development. Also, sometimes Ukrainian missiles, not just drones, reaching far beyond Ukraine's borders. From the Russian side, it seems like they're actually moving more towards civilian infrastructure. So we've seen attacks on the railways, on civilian trains, people having to kind of rush out at last minute to get out of carriages that are being attacked. In places like Kharkiv, we've seen attacks on food wholesalers, so the kind of supermarket systems, gas stations, anything that basically makes life possible for civilians in these frontline regions. And that is obviously something that is, people here have gone through with the winter, the attacks on the energy system, and now the real prospect of the summer that Russia might try and destroy parts of Ukraine's water system to make life in the summer a whole lot more difficult.
We saw an interesting line from a Ukrainian in the piece who said, "This is not ending in my lifetime nor in yours." And on that point, Nick, I'd like to ask you, talks on ending the war are stalled, of course. Bring us up to date on the prospects for peace talks and the main sticking points at the moment.
So I think in terms of talks, there are very little hopes that anything is going to happen anytime soon. We've seen the US team, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, who were kind of shuttling between DC and Moscow and occasionally meeting the Ukrainians in Florida. They've basically given up on Ukraine and moved on to the Middle East. Some talked that it was about their reluctance to come to Kyiv was about not wanting to take the train because you can't fly into Ukraine because of the danger. But I think realistically this is just about the fact that they can't make much progress because Russia still wants basically exactly the same things that Vladimir Putin was demanding at the beginning of this war in 2022. He basically wants Ukraine in such a vulnerable state in terms of reducing its army, in terms of not getting security guarantees from the rest of Europe, in terms of giving up territory that it still controls, creating the kind of internal political problems for Ukraine that would then make it easier for him to take another bite a couple of years down the line. There's a real sense right now that Russia might potentially be willing to pause this war for a bit if it gets enough in the way of goodies in terms of concessions from Ukraine, but then will finish the job when the rest of the world is distracted a couple of years down the line. So that is something that you hear from soldiers on the front lines all the time. If I don't do this job, if I don't finish protecting this country, then my kids will have to do the same thing 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So there's a real sense now that this is basically about surviving, holding out, that this is a war that is going to basically end when one of the sides loses resources and can't fight on. And people here in Ukraine are hoping that with European resources, they're the ones who'll be able to hold out longest.
Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you, Nick.